Case 1. Mary Kay Schlase, homicide conviction. In 1974, 18-year-old Mary Kay Schlase, a hitchhiker traveling across the United States, was found brutally stabbed to death in a secluded area. The crime sent shockwaves through the local community, and a wave of media attention followed. However, despite the efforts of investigators, the case quickly grew cold, leaving her family to grapple with years of uncertainty. Mary Kay Schlase, an 18-year-old artist from Minneapolis, was found murdered on February 15, 1974, near the intersection of 4/8th Avenue and 990th Street, in the township of Spring Brook, Dunn County, Wisconsin. At the time, investigators believed she had been hitchhiking from Minneapolis to Chicago for an art show when she met her demise. The crime scene was situated in a rural area of western Wisconsin, approximately 90 miles east of Minneapolis. Schlase's body was discovered in a ditch along a dead-end road near Elk Creek Lake. A witness reported seeing a man and woman fighting in a gold-colored compact car before the body was found. Schlase had been stabbed at least 15 times and suffered a broken nose, indicating a violent struggle. Her purse and coat were missing and have never been located. The early investigation into Schlase's murder saw extensive interviews with people who may have interacted with her before her death, but there were no significant leads. Authorities combed through records of other missing persons in the region, but none seemed to fit the same pattern. With limited forensic tools available in the 1970s, law enforcement relied on witness statements, fingerprints, and witness testimony. However, these efforts proved insufficient. As the case progressed, police could not find a definitive suspect, and the leads from the investigation soon dried up. The absence of modern DNA testing capabilities meant that evidence collected at the scene, including blood samples and fibers, could not be conclusively matched to any known suspects. By the end of the 1970s, the case was essentially at a standstill. The passage of time led to fading memories, and no new evidence surfaced, allowing the case to fall into cold case archives. For the next few years, Schlase's family lived with a constant sense of grief and uncertainty. As the years passed, the initial forensic evidence that had been collected became increasingly difficult to analyze. At the time of the murder, DNA testing had not yet been developed, and investigators relied on techniques such as fingerprint analysis and witness testimony, both of which failed to provide definitive answers. Additionally, the lack of reliable or consistent witnesses compounded the investigation's challenges. The case suffered from what is often called investigative fatigue. The more time passed, the less likely it seemed that anyone would come forward with useful information. By the 1990s, the case had long since gone cold, and like many others, it was relegated to a forgotten file in the back of a detective's desk. Schlase's family, though determined to find the truth, were left with little hope that the case would ever be solved. In 2025, a game-changing breakthrough occurred, thanks to advances in forensic DNA technology and cold case genealogy. Investigators, now armed with more sophisticated tools than they had in the 1970s, revisited the old evidence. DNA samples from the crime scene, originally too degraded or incomplete to be analyzed with the methods of the time, were now able to be tested using modern STR-mix software and familial DNA matching. Using this technology, investigators were able to trace the DNA back to John Miller, a man who had been living in the area at the time of Schlase's murder. Miller, now 84, had no prior criminal record, which made his identification all the more shocking. Using genealogical databases such as GEDmatch, investigators were able to piece together his family tree and confirm that he was a match to DNA found at the crime scene. In early 2025, Miller was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The breakthrough was a testament to the power of modern technology in solving cases that would have otherwise remained unsolved. John Miller's arrest came as a shock not only because of his age, but also because he had lived a life seemingly free of violent crimes. He had no criminal record and had led a quiet existence in the same community where Schlase had been murdered. The identification of Miller as the perpetrator was made possible by the application of familial DNA matching, a tool that allows investigators to identify suspects by tracing the DNA of their relatives. Once the connection was made, the authorities moved quickly to arrest Miller. While there is no clear motive as to why Miller killed Schlase, investigators suspect that it may have been a crime of opportunity or a spur-of-the-moment attack, as there was no known relationship between him and the victim. Because of his age and the passage of time, there will be no trial by jury, but the case has officially been resolved, with Miller's arrest providing the family with the justice they had long waited for. While Miller's arrest and conviction brought closure to the case, the motive behind the murder remains unclear. Investigators have speculated that Miller may have acted impulsively, seeing Schlase as an easy target on her journey. There are no known ties between Miller and Schlase, and it remains unclear whether he had any prior relationship with her. Some speculate that he could have been under the influence of alcohol or drugs at the time of the crime, but no definitive explanation for his actions has been provided. Despite the lack of clarity around his motives, the case is officially closed with Miller's conviction, offering a sense of finality to a case that had long haunted Schlase's family. For Schlase's family, the resolution of the case was both a relief and a painful reminder of the years they spent without answers. "It's been a long wait for justice," said the family in a statement. They expressed gratitude for the work of the investigators and the use of modern forensic techniques that allowed them to finally get the closure they had longed for. While the justice they received was overdue, it was still deeply appreciated. The pain of losing Mary in such a violent and senseless way could never be erased, but knowing that her killer had finally been identified brought a measure of peace. The local community, which had been shaken by the brutal murder back in the 1970s, also felt the weight of the case being solved. For many, the arrest of Miller and the resolution of Schlase's murder was a reminder of how far forensic science has come and how it continues to evolve, giving families like Mary's a chance to see justice done, no matter how long it takes. Case 2. Breakthrough in Amy Bradley's 1998 disappearance. On March 24, 1998, 23-year-old Amy Bradley, a bright and promising young woman from the U.S., vanished without a trace while aboard the Royal Caribbean cruise ship Rhapsody of the Seas. The ship, docked off the coast of Curaçao in the Caribbean, became the site of one of the most baffling disappearances of the 1990s. Despite an initial flurry of media attention and a widespread search, Amy's whereabouts remained a mystery. Over the years, numerous theories emerged, from abduction to the possibility of human trafficking, but no definitive answers surfaced. The case remained unresolved for nearly 2 decades, fading into the background of cold case files. Then, in 2025, a breakthrough came, ignited by a Netflix documentary series that reignited public interest. This renewed focus led to new tips, fresh investigative leads, and, for the first time in 27 years, the possibility that Amy may still be alive. Amy Bradley's disappearance occurred under chilling circumstances. One moment, she was in her cabin, speaking with family members. The next, she was gone. Her absence was immediately noticed, and an extensive search began, both on the ship and on the surrounding islands. Initially, law enforcement considered various possibilities, including the theory that she had fallen overboard or voluntarily left the ship. However, no physical evidence supported either theory, and no trace of Amy was found in the waters surrounding Curaçao. With no conclusive evidence and no witnesses who could offer a clear account of what had transpired, the case quickly became mired in confusion and speculation. As time went on, the absence of fresh leads allowed the case to stagnate, leaving Amy's family in an agonizing state of uncertainty. The initial investigation focused on interviews with the ship's crew and passengers. Investigators were determined to understand any possible motives for Amy's disappearance and to determine whether there were any clues hidden within the ship's vast interior. But witness testimonies from crew members varied significantly, which only deepened the confusion. Some reported seeing Amy on the deck of the ship the night she disappeared, while others claimed they saw nothing unusual. Despite these inconsistencies, there was one possible lead that persisted. Several witnesses came forward stating they had seen Amy on land, in a nearby location, after the ship had set sail. This theory led investigators to briefly entertain the possibility that Amy had been abducted and trafficked, but no hard evidence was ever found to substantiate the claim. The lack of physical evidence, combined with the contradictory witness reports, left investigators with no clear direction to follow. Over the years, the investigation into Amy Bradley's disappearance suffered from multiple failures. The absence of physical evidence meant that investigators were left without a solid foundation to pursue further leads. Witness accounts were inconsistent, and the sheer size of the ship, combined with the number of passengers and crew, made it difficult to pinpoint any meaningful clues. Theories ranging from abduction to suicide were considered, but none could be definitively proven. The limited forensic capabilities of the time also hindered progress. Moreover, jurisdictional issues between the U.S. and the authorities in Curaçao created significant barriers in the investigation, delaying any real progress. As the years passed, media attention shifted to other high-profile cases, and Amy's case slowly faded into the background, leaving her family in an unrelenting state of grief, but with a glimmer of hope that one day the truth would emerge. In 2025, a new wave of interest in the case was sparked by the release of the Netflix documentary series The Missing Girl, Amy Bradley. The series, which detailed Amy's disappearance and the subsequent investigation, quickly became a global hit, climbing the ranks of the most-watched documentaries of the year. The renewed attention brought forward a wave of new tips, with many viewers offering insights and leads that had been overlooked before. One of the most startling developments was the confirmation through DNA evidence that Amy may still be alive. A DNA match suggested that Amy had survived after her disappearance, and further investigations pointed to the possibility that she had even given birth, leading investigators to consider human trafficking as a more probable scenario. This breakthrough provided her family with renewed hope and refocused law enforcement's efforts on locating her. While no suspects have been arrested in connection with Amy's disappearance, the 2025 developments have rekindled the investigation. The primary focus has shifted to investigating potential human trafficking rings that may have been operating in the region during the time of Amy's disappearance. Although no direct arrests have been made, the new evidence and renewed interest in the case have spurred a re-evaluation of leads that had previously been ignored. Law enforcement is now investigating whether the trafficking theory holds merit and if it can provide the key to locating Amy. Additionally, new witness statements have suggested that she may have been forced to stay hidden for years, possibly under the control of those involved in trafficking. While this case remains unsolved, the pursuit of justice has not slowed. The motive for Amy Bradley's disappearance remains unclear. While some investigators speculate that she may have been targeted by a trafficking ring, the true nature of her fate is still unknown. The recent breakthroughs in the case suggest that Amy did not voluntarily disappear, as initially thought, but may have been coerced into remaining hidden for reasons that are not yet fully understood. While the case has not yet reached a resolution, the new leads have revived the search for Amy, offering her family a renewed sense of hope. However, until Amy is found or new information surfaces, the question of why she was targeted remains unanswered. Amy Bradley's family has never stopped searching for her. Despite the years of heartache and unanswered questions, they have remained steadfast in their belief that Amy is alive and can still be found. Her brother, Brad Bradley, has consistently spoken to the media, urging the public to remain vigilant and supportive of the search for his sister. "We never gave up hope," said Amy's mother, whose words have resonated deeply with the public. The recent breakthroughs in the case have given the family new strength, and while the pain of her absence remains, they now hold on to the possibility that they may one day be reunited with Amy. The public's renewed interest, sparked by the documentary, has also provided them with a sense of solidarity and reinforced their commitment to finding Amy and bringing her home. Case 3. The murder of Carol Skidmore solved. In 1975, Carol Skidmore, a 28-year-old mother, was brutally murdered in Florida. Her skeletal remains were discovered months later in a remote wooded area, but despite initial efforts by law enforcement, no suspects were identified, and the case went cold. For nearly 45 years, her family was left in agonizing uncertainty, never knowing who was responsible for the tragedy. It wasn't until 2025 that the case was finally cracked, thanks to modern advancements in forensic technology and the power of familial DNA genealogy. The arrest of the suspect, made possible by forensic genealogy, provided long-awaited closure for the Skidmore family and the local community, marking the end of an era of unanswered questions. Carol Skidmore was last seen alive in the summer of 1975. Her sudden disappearance left her family and friends in distress. After an extensive search, her remains were discovered in a wooded area not far from her home. Although the cause of death appeared to be foul play, the initial investigation yielded few clues. There were no eyewitnesses, and the evidence left behind at the crime scene was minimal. For years, the case remained stagnant, with little to no progress. As time passed, the leads faded, and the case became one of Florida's many unsolved mysteries. It wasn't until 2025 that a breakthrough in forensic technology brought the case back into the spotlight, providing the Skidmore family with the closure they had desperately needed. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement, FDLE, was tasked with investigating Carol's disappearance and the discovery of her remains. Despite following up on various leads, including interviewing friends and family, no one could be definitively linked to the crime. Investigators worked with the limited forensic resources available at the time, but there was no conclusive physical evidence to point to a suspect. As DNA technology was still in its early stages during the initial investigation, it was not considered a viable tool at the time. For years, the case was revisited intermittently by law enforcement, but with little success. The lack of new leads and insufficient technology left the case to grow cold, and it slowly slipped from public consciousness. Over the years, the investigation faced numerous obstacles. One of the biggest challenges was the lack of forensic technology available at the time of Carol's murder. The DNA evidence that had been collected from the crime scene was poorly preserved, and the tools available for DNA analysis were not advanced enough to provide meaningful results. Additionally, the absence of reliable witnesses or new information made it difficult for investigators to build any momentum. The case became one of those tragic instances where the lack of sufficient evidence and resources led to an investigation that stalled, despite the best efforts of law enforcement. The funding for cold case investigations was often limited, and cases like Carol's were sometimes sidelined as new crimes took priority. As the years went by, the case remained unsolved, leaving the family to wonder whether they would ever get answers. In 2025, the case was revived with the help of modern forensic techniques, most notably familial DNA genealogy. This method, which involves searching genealogical databases for potential relatives of a suspect, had recently gained recognition as a powerful tool in solving cold cases. By comparing the DNA recovered from the crime scene to public genealogy databases, investigators were able to identify a distant relative of the suspected perpetrator. Using forensic genealogy, FGG, they were able to build a family tree that led to a DNA match with a suspect. The breakthrough came when investigators conducted a trash pull from the suspect's home, and the DNA match confirmed their suspicions. This innovative method of solving cold cases, which was once considered a long shot, had now successfully identified the killer after decades of mystery. The suspect, identified in 2025, was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. The arrest came as a shock to the community, as the suspect had never before been linked to the crime. He had been living under the radar for years, with no prior criminal history related to the case. The suspect's identity was not immediately made public, as law enforcement worked to gather more evidence before proceeding with the trial. The motive behind the murder is believed to be personal in nature, linked to a prior domestic dispute. However, the full details of the relationship between Carol and the suspect remain unclear. What is known is that the suspect's DNA was the key to solving the case, and the long-awaited arrest brought a sense of justice to the family. While the case has been officially resolved with the suspect's arrest, the true motive behind Carol's murder is still being pieced together. Investigators believe the crime was the result of a domestic conflict that escalated into violence. The suspect's connection to Carol and the nature of their relationship are still under investigation, but it is believed that the murder was not random. The family has long suspected that the truth would eventually come to light, and now, with the suspect in custody, the case is moving toward resolution. The trial will likely shed more light on the specific details behind the tragic event, but for now, the Skidmore family has the answers they waited so long for. Carol Skidmore's sister, who had tirelessly fought for justice over the years, expressed deep relief upon hearing about the arrest. "This is what we've waited for," she said, tears of gratitude in her eyes. The family, who had never given up hope, finally feels a sense of peace. The community, too, was shaken by the revelation of the suspect's identity. For so long, the case had been an unresolved chapter in the town's history, and now, with the arrest, there is a renewed sense of closure. Though the pain of Carol's loss remains, the family can now move forward with the knowledge that justice has been served. Carol's memory, though never forgotten, can now be honored with the truth. Case 4. The 1979 Karen Tate murder, Perth, Australia. In 1979, Karen Tate, a 24-year-old woman from Perth, Australia, was found brutally murdered in her home. Despite an immediate investigation, the case quickly went cold. For decades, her family was left without answers, the crime becoming a haunting, unsolved mystery. However, in 2025, the case was finally cracked open after nearly 45 years, thanks to modern forensic advancements, particularly in familial DNA genealogy. This breakthrough brought the shocking revelation that Terrence John Fisher, who had died years earlier, was responsible for the crime. Though Fisher couldn't face trial, his identification provided long-awaited closure to Karen's family and the Perth community. Karen Tate was last seen alive on June 8, 1979, and her body was discovered several days later. She had been savagely attacked in her own home, a crime that appeared both random and violent. Investigators quickly followed the typical routes, speaking with family members, friends, and acquaintances to search for any personal motive. Yet no clear connection emerged between Karen and any known suspects. The initial theory suggested a burglary gone wrong, but no items of value were taken from the home, which cast doubt on this explanation. Despite a thorough investigation, the case languished in the cold files of the Perth police force, with no new evidence surfacing to move the case forward. The initial investigation was extensive, involving interviews with those close to Karen and attempts to uncover any connections between her and potential suspects. Detectives also collected forensic evidence from the crime scene, including hair and fiber samples, but the results failed to lead to any significant breakthroughs. With limited forensic technology available in 1979, investigators lacked the tools to test DNA and match it to potential suspects. Over time, as the investigation turned up no viable suspects and no further physical evidence, the case stagnated. Despite periodic reopenings by the Perth police, the case slipped into obscurity, as more recent crimes took precedence and resources for cold cases were scarce. For over 4 decades, the case remained unsolved. Several factors contributed to the prolonged stagnation. First and foremost was the limited forensic technology available at the time of the investigation. While physical evidence was collected, including hair and fiber samples, the lack of DNA testing meant that investigators were unable to definitively link the evidence to a suspect. Further, the absence of witnesses, coupled with no clear motive, made it difficult to pursue any concrete leads. Even when the case was revisited over the years, there were no new witnesses, and no technological advancements helped make the breakthrough. In the 1980s and 1990s, the lack of DNA databases and genealogical tools meant that the evidence collected remained untested. As the years passed, the case grew colder, and the prospects of finding a resolution grew slimmer. In 2025, a breakthrough occurred when investigators re-examined the case using modern forensic genealogy. This cutting-edge technique allows law enforcement to search genealogical databases for distant relatives of potential suspects. In Karen's case, this method identified a match to Terrence John Fisher, who had passed away several years earlier. Forensic genealogists built a family tree using DNA from the crime scene, eventually leading them to Fisher as a suspect. The critical moment came when investigators pulled a DNA sample from Fisher's posthumous relatives, confirming the match to the crime scene evidence. The use of STR-Mix software, a tool that interprets complex DNA samples, played a crucial role in confirming the identity of the suspect, allowing authorities to close the case and finally provide answers to the Tate family. Although Terrence John Fisher was identified as the murderer, He had already passed away by the time the breakthrough occurred, making it impossible to arrest or prosecute him. Despite his death, the case was officially marked as closed in 2025, with no charges filed due to the suspect's death. Fisher was posthumously identified through familial DNA, which linked him to the crime. While no physical confrontation occurred with the suspect, his identification was significant in ensuring that the case reached a resolution. Fisher had no previous criminal record linked to the case, and his identification provided clarity after years of uncertainty. This also meant that the case was not only closed but solved definitively, marking a pivotal moment in forensic history. The motive behind the murder remains unclear, with investigators speculating that the crime may have been the result of random violence. While there was no direct evidence of a personal connection between Fisher and Karen, the brutality of the attack suggests that it was not a chance event, but rather a targeted act. Investigators theorize that Fisher, who had lived in the same neighborhood as Karen, may have been motivated by an unknown grudge or mental instability. However, without Fisher's testimony, the exact reasons behind the murder will remain speculative. Despite this uncertainty, the resolution of the case allowed the community and the family to find a sense of closure. The family, particularly Karen's brother, who had spent decades hoping for justice, finally saw the case come to a definitive conclusion. "We never thought we'd see this day," said Karen Tate's brother, reflecting on the long journey to justice. His words echoed the sentiment of the entire family, who had waited for decades to uncover the truth. The identification of Fisher, though bittersweet, brought an end to years of unanswered questions. The community of Perth, too, found solace in the resolution of a case that had long haunted them. While the timing of the breakthrough was delayed, the identification of Fisher gave the family the closure they desperately sought. Although the pain of losing Karen will never fully fade, knowing the identity of the murderer allowed her family to begin healing. The community could finally begin to move on, no longer burdened by an unsolved mystery. If you are enjoying this content, like, subscribe, and share to your loved ones to protect them from the same tragic happening to them in the future. Case 5. The Murder of Louisa Dunn. It was a quiet summer morning in Easton, Bristol, in 1967, when the life of 75-year-old Louisa Jane Dunn came to a tragic end. A well-known figure in her neighborhood, Louisa was respected and adored, a woman who had lived through 2 world wars and 2 marriages. Her small terraced home at 58 Britannia Road was always neatly kept, her doorstep freshly swept, her demeanor warm but reserved. When a neighbor knocked that June morning and got no reply, no one imagined that the discovery inside would remain a mystery for nearly 6 decades. Between June 26 and 28, 1967, Louisa Dunn was attacked and killed inside her home. The violence shocked even seasoned investigators from the Avon and Somerset police, who quickly arrived at the scene. Louisa had been strangled, and the room showed signs of a struggle. Her death certificate later listed asphyxiation due to strangulation as the cause of death. It was clear she had fought back, but the attacker had overpowered her. The local community was stunned. Louisa wasn't wealthy, and no valuables appeared to be missing. Her door had been forced, suggesting that the intruder may have entered uninvited or caught her by surprise. Within days, the murder became one of Bristol's most talked about tragedies, an unthinkable act in a neighborhood where everyone knew each other. The investigation began immediately under the leadership of senior detectives from the Avon and Somerset Constabulary. Officers conducted door-to-door inquiries, interviewing neighbors and tradesmen who might have visited the street that week. Witnesses reported hearing faint cries on the night of June 27th, but could not identify the source. Police examined the home for fingerprints, fibers, and footprints, the most advanced methods available at the time. Yet technology in 1967 had limitations. DNA profiling did not exist. Blood typing could only narrow possibilities, not confirm identities. Investigators collected biological samples from the scene, including material from the victim's clothing, but the science to interpret it was decades away. Early suspicion fell on local men with prior burglary records, but each was cleared. The lack of eyewitnesses or forensic matches meant that after months of intense searching, the case reached a dead end. Over the years, Louisa's file became one of hundreds gathering dust in police archives. Forensic science moved forward, but the physical samples from her case remained sealed in evidence storage, awaiting a future where they might be useful again. By the 1980s, DNA testing began revolutionizing criminal investigations, yet early samples from 1967 were often too degraded for analysis. There were procedural failures too. Some evidence logs were incomplete, and the early lack of chain of custody documentation meant that samples had to be verified and recatalogued before any new testing could occur. Budget constraints and competing priorities in the 1990s pushed the case further down the list of active reviews. For Louisa's relatives, especially her nieces and grandchildren, it became a generational wound. Every few years they would inquire about progress, only to be told the same thing. We're still waiting for the right technology. That long-awaited moment finally arrived in 2023, when detectives from the Avon and Somerset Cold Case Unit began re-evaluating unsolved homicides suitable for modern testing. Among the archived boxes was one marked simply, "Done, LJ, 1967. Inside were clothing samples and swabs carefully preserved despite the passage of time. Forensic scientists at the Home Office Forensic Laboratory retested them using STR-mix probabilistic genotyping and advanced DNA sequencing. To their surprise, they recovered a complete male DNA profile, a near miracle after 58 years. The profile was run through the UK National DNA Database, producing a partial familial match to a man living in Ipswich. That match led investigators to Ryland Headley, an elderly man born in the West Indies in 1932, who had emigrated to Britain in the 1950s. When detectives compared palm prints preserved from the crime scene to Headley's records, the result was undeniable. Headley had been living in Bristol at the time of Louisa's death and had prior convictions for burglary and assault. In November 2024, police arrested the then 92-year-old Headley. During questioning, he denied knowing Louisa Dunn, but the scientific evidence was overwhelming. Forensic experts testified that the probability of the DNA belonging to anyone else was less than 1 in a billion. The Crown Prosecution Service authorized charges of murder and rape, setting the stage for what would become a landmark courtroom moment in British legal history. The trial opened at Bristol Crown Court in June 2025. The courtroom was filled with journalists, family members, and local residents who had lived through the fear of the unsolved crime. Prosecutors reconstructed the case using modern forensic evidence and historical police reports. They revealed how Headley had targeted elderly women, often breaking into their homes and attacking them when they were alone. In a chilling pattern, Headley had been convicted in the 1970s of 2 similar assaults on elderly women in Suffolk and Norfolk. He served a reduced sentence after appeal, just 2 years, and disappeared into anonymity afterward. The Bristol case tied those earlier offenses together, establishing a disturbing behavioral pattern. On 30th of June 2025, the jury returned a unanimous guilty verdict. Justice Derek Sweeting sentenced Headley to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years, noting that he would likely spend the remainder of his life behind bars. At 92, he became the oldest convicted murderer in UK history. Even after conviction, the question of motive lingered. Police and prosecutors concluded that Louisa's death was most likely a burglary that escalated into violence. However, Headley's history of targeting elderly women suggested deeper psychological motives, a desire for control and domination. He never confessed, maintaining his innocence until the end. For the investigators, the conviction marked a triumph of perseverance and science. For Louisa's family, it was bittersweet. They had waited almost 60 years for closure, and though justice had arrived late, it arrived nonetheless. After the verdict, Louisa's surviving relatives issued a brief but powerful statement. For decades, our family lived with a question that had no answer. Today, we can finally let her rest. Justice was long overdue, but it came. The Bristol community also responded with relief and pride. The case that had haunted generations was finally closed, not through luck or confession, but through science and determination. Local papers hailed it as the victory of patience over time. Detectives involved in the case reflected on its broader meaning. It was not just about solving a murder, it was about restoring faith that no victim is ever forgotten. Cold case experts now cite the Dunn investigation as a model for long-term evidence preservation and forensic review. Case 6. Susan Goodwin murder solved. In July 2002, Susan Goodwin, a mother of two, vanished from her rural home in Naracoorte, South Australia. Her disappearance was sudden, leaving behind no clues and no indication of foul play. Despite an extensive search and numerous interviews with family members, friends, and neighbors, Susan was never found. For years, the case remained a mystery, and her family was left in limbo, unable to find closure. However, in 2025, a breakthrough came that would finally answer questions that had haunted Susan's loved ones for more than 2 decades. Human remains discovered in a remote area were positively identified as Susan's, and DNA evidence led investigators to a suspect who was arrested and charged with her murder, bringing closure to a case that had long seemed unsolvable. Susan Goodwin, a 34-year-old mother, was last seen on July 5, 2002. Her 2 young children were left alone in the house when Susan disappeared, and there were no signs of forced entry or struggle. The absence of her car, purse, and phone inside the house suggested that she had not left voluntarily. Initially, law enforcement speculated that she may have been abducted or fallen victim to foul play, but no witnesses could provide any helpful information. The search for Susan stretched on for weeks, with family members, friends, and local authorities tirelessly scouring the surrounding areas. However, the lack of any physical evidence or witnesses made it impossible to pinpoint what had happened. As weeks turned into months, and then years, Susan's disappearance became a cold case, with little hope remaining for her safe return. In the days following Susan's disappearance, investigators from the South Australian Police launched a full-scale search of the area surrounding her home. Detectives spoke to her family, neighbors, and close acquaintances, looking for any leads that might explain her sudden disappearance. Despite these efforts, the case quickly grew cold. Investigators looked into the possibility of an abduction or a voluntary departure, but there was no evidence to support either. The police also investigated whether Susan had experienced any personal conflicts, but none of the leads proved fruitful. The absence of forensic evidence, such as blood or fingerprints, and the lack of eyewitnesses left the case in a state of limbo. The investigation stalled, and as years passed, Susan's case was pushed to the back of the cold case files, left unsolved and largely forgotten by the public. The failure to solve Susan's case in the early years was due to several factors. The most significant was the lack of physical evidence. Without any DNA, fingerprints, or a body to examine, investigators had little to work with. The absence of credible leads from the community further complicated the investigation. Many theories were floated during the investigation, some suggesting that Susan may have left on her own, while others speculated she had fallen victim to a random attack, but no solid evidence pointed to any one explanation. The cold case division of the South Australian Police had limited resources, and as newer, more pressing cases took priority, Susan's case fell further into obscurity. Without modern DNA technology to re-examine the evidence, the case remained unsolved, leaving Susan's family to endure years of uncertainty. In 2025, a breakthrough occurred that would change everything. A tip-off from the public led to the discovery of human remains in a remote area not far from Susan's home. DNA tests confirmed that the remains belonged to Susan Goodwin, providing the first concrete evidence that she had not simply disappeared, but had met with foul play. Once the remains were identified, investigators turned their focus back to the case, using modern forensic techniques to re-examine the evidence. DNA analysis led authorities to a familial DNA match, a breakthrough that would eventually lead to the identification of Susan's murderer. The match connected the remains to John Misloff, a local man who had lived in the same community as Susan. Misloff was arrested and charged with Susan's murder, marking a significant moment in the long unsolved case. John Misloff was arrested in 2025 after DNA evidence linked him to Susan's remains. The investigation revealed that Misloff had been in contact with Susan around the time of her disappearance, though the exact nature of their relationship remains unclear. Misloff, previously unknown to law enforcement in connection to this case, was charged with second-degree murder. He was taken into custody and is awaiting trial. The arrest came as a shock to the community, as Mislov had no prior criminal record connected to Susan's case. However, the DNA match was irrefutable, and authorities now believe that Mislov's involvement in Susan's death stemmed from a personal conflict. While the full details of the crime remain unclear, investigators believe Mislov may have been driven by an unresolved dispute with Susan. As of now, no charges have been brought against anyone else, and Mislov is the only suspect in the case. The resolution of Susan Goodwin's case has brought a sense of closure to her family, but the motive remains unclear. Investigators suspect that Mislov's actions were driven by a personal conflict, but the specifics of that conflict remain speculative. The lack of a clear relationship between Mislov and Susan makes the crime feel even more senseless. While it's believed that the murder was not random, the lack of detailed evidence linking the two complicates the investigation into a definitive motive. Susan's family has endured over 2 decades of grief and uncertainty. "It's been a long wait, but we can finally begin to heal," said her family members after hearing of Mislov's arrest. For them, the long-awaited resolution has allowed them to confront the loss of Susan with the certainty that justice is being served. While the years without answers were painful, the identification of the perpetrator has brought them a sense of peace, even though the pain of Susan's loss remains. The local community, once shaken by the sudden disappearance of one of their own, can now move forward with the knowledge that the truth has been uncovered. The case is now closed, but the memory of Susan's life will remain, forever marked by the tireless efforts of her family and the authorities who worked to bring justice to her name. Case 7, Ivan Milat's case. In the 1990s, Ivan Milat became synonymous with terror after his conviction for the brutal murders of 7 young backpackers in Australia. Known as the Backpacker Murders, Milat's crimes shocked the nation, leaving the victims' families and the public searching for answers. Despite his imprisonment, questions remained about whether Milat was responsible for other unsolved disappearances. For decades, his involvement in additional murders was speculated, but it wasn't until 2025 that modern forensic methods allowed investigators to re-examine old evidence, potentially linking him to more unsolved cases. With advances in genetic genealogy and STR-mix software, investigators are now probing whether Milat's horrific legacy extends beyond the 7 victims he was convicted for. Ivan Milat's notorious murder spree began in the late 1980s and continued into the early 1990s. Milat, who worked as a truck driver, targeted young travelers, backpackers from various countries making their way across Australia. The victims, all hitchhikers, were abducted, subjected to horrific violence, and left for dead in the Belanglo State Forest in New South Wales. Their bodies were found in various stages of decay, and Milat's arrest in 1994 was the culmination of years of investigation, which eventually led to his conviction. However, despite his imprisonment, the questions around Milat's full involvement in the disappearances of other young travelers remained unresolved. There was speculation, especially among the families of missing persons, that Milat could have been responsible for other murders, but the evidence was insufficient to make any further arrests. Investigators had always suspected that his crimes extended beyond the 7 victims known, but the lack of DNA technology at the time limited their ability to confirm these suspicions. The initial investigation into Milat's known crimes was extensive, involving thousands of hours of police work, interviews, and searches. When Milat was finally arrested in 1994, authorities were confident they had caught the man responsible for the backpacker murders. Investigators meticulously examined Milat's movements, connections to the victims, and the locations where the bodies were discovered. DNA evidence collected from the crime scenes, including blood and hair samples, helped secure Milat's conviction. Yet even as Milat sat behind bars, authorities and families of other missing backpackers suspected that more victims existed, but no concrete proof was found to connect Milat to these additional disappearances. The lack of modern forensic tools at the time made it difficult to track connections between Milat and other missing persons cases. While the police followed up on every lead, the absence of DNA profiling and genealogical databases meant that many clues remained overlooked. For many years, the investigation into potential additional victims of Milat went nowhere. The absence of solid evidence linking him to other murders left the cases of missing travelers unsolved. In the early years, investigators focused on Milat's known victims and the connections between the places where the bodies were found. But with no additional forensic tools like DNA matching, the evidence collected at the time could not definitively connect Milat to other disappearances. Over time, the cold cases were sidelined as new investigations arose, and as the years passed, it became increasingly difficult to revisit these old files without any new leads. With the failure of traditional investigative methods and the limitations of forensic tools, many missing persons cases were closed, and Milat's crimes seemed to be confined to the 7 confirmed victims. The case grew cold, leaving families without answers and investigators without new evidence to pursue. In 2025, advancements in forensic technology led to a monumental breakthrough. Using genetic genealogy, investigators revisited evidence from Milat's known murder scenes, looking for any connection to unsolved disappearances. This technique, which uses DNA from family members in genealogical databases to trace potential suspects, proved to be a game-changer. Investigators were able to identify new links between Milat and missing persons cases that had long been considered unrelated. Using STRmix software to analyze the DNA from Milat's confirmed victims, authorities discovered partial DNA matches to several of the missing travelers. The breakthrough was not only a major moment for the case, but also for the field of forensic science. The application of familial DNA analysis to cold cases like this is a powerful tool in solving unsolved murders. This discovery led authorities to reopen investigations into those disappearances, confirming Milat's involvement in several additional cases. Despite the breakthrough, no new arrests have been made. The key issue remains that Ivan Milat, the man who committed these heinous acts, died in 2019. While his involvement in additional murders has been confirmed through DNA matching, Milat's death means that no criminal trial will occur for these new victims. However, the identification of Milat as a suspect in these other disappearances is significant. The case has been officially updated to reflect the new findings, but there will be no formal prosecution. The focus has shifted to gathering as much information as possible about Milat's life and activities during the period in question. This posthumous identification, although unable to bring Milat to trial, brings closure to families who have long suspected Milat's involvement in their loved ones' disappearances. While the case is technically closed due to Milat's death, the motive behind the additional murders remains unclear. Investigators suspect that these disappearances, like the 7 known murders, were likely random acts of violence. Milat's victims were chosen based on their vulnerability, young solo travelers, yet no clear pattern has emerged beyond this. The brutality of the crimes suggests a deep-seated need for control or power, and Milat's sadistic tendencies were evident in his known murders. The motive behind these new potential victims may follow a similar pattern, but the lack of living witnesses and Milat's inability to explain his actions leaves many questions unanswered. For the families of the new victims, this breakthrough brings mixed emotions. The search for justice continues, said relatives of the other missing persons who are now linked to Milat. The news that Milat's crimes may have been far more extensive than previously known is both a bitter realization and a long-awaited confirmation. These families have waited for years to hear the truth, and while the breakthrough brings them closer to it, the fact that Milat cannot be prosecuted for these additional crimes adds a layer of complexity to the closure. The broader community, too, is grappling with the implications of this new discovery. Milat's legacy as one of Australia's most infamous serial killers is now irrevocably tied to more victims than anyone initially believed. Thank you for your incredible support. This channel thrives because of viewers like you. Join our YouTube membership today to unlock exclusive perks, enjoy premium content, and help us keep creating the stories you love. Which story do you want to be covered?